Hello, good morning, good afternoon to our audience members joining us from across the globe. I'm Raymond Karam, the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's program titled Iranian Protests and Tehran's Regional Role, which will examine the effects, if any, that the internal protests in Iran have had on Iran's regional calculus, its relations with its neighbors, and its ability via proxies or otherwise to project its power beyond its borders. We have a stellar lineup with us today. I'll introduce our speakers very briefly here and share a link to their full bios in the chat with you all. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Sanam Vakil, the Deputy Director of the Middle East North Africa Program at Chatham House, where she leads project work on Iran and Gulf Arab dynamics. Her research focuses on regional security, Gulf politics, geopolitics, and future trends in Iran's domestic and foreign policies. Also with us is Dr. Mohammed Sulami, the founder and president of the International Institute for Iranian Studies, Rasanah, based in Riyadh. He is also an assistant professor of Iranian Studies at Al-Qura University in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. Last but not least is my colleague Ali Alfoneh, senior fellow at AGSIW, who's joining us live from Tokyo. We appreciate you being with us, Ali, despite the late hour. Ali is a political scientist by training and the originator of the theory of the transformation of the Islamic Republic into a military dictatorship. His latest book is The Political Succession in the Islamic Republic of Iran, Demise of the Clergy and the Rise of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Moderating the session today is Ambassador William Roebuck, the Executive Vice President of AGSIW. He most recently served as the Deputy Special Envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS and a Senior Advisor to the Special Representative for Syria Engagement. Previously, he served as the U.S. Ambassador to Bahrain from 2015 to 2017. And with that, Bill, over to you.
Thank you, Raymond. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. We're delighted to be able to discuss this issue today with our distinguished panel. We're going to examine the phenomenon of mass protest in Iran. I think the basic information is familiar to everyone. Nearly 600 protesters have been killed since the protests were triggered in mid-September by the death in custody of Mahsa Amini for allegedly violating dress rules in Iran. Hundreds more have been seriously wounded. Some 20,000 people or more have been arrested, and nearly 20 have been charged with capital crimes, with 4 already executed since December. We'll try to understand the causes for this unrest, take a bearing on where things stand now and where they might be headed, and assess the achievements of the protesters, or put another way, assess the significance of these months of unrest. And we'll try to understand the impact of the protests on the Iranian regime and how the protests have reverberated in the broader Gulf region and in the international community. So let's get started. I'm going to ask an opening question and kick this discussion off. Sanam, if you would, on Saturday, Iranian President Raisi took a victory lap, so to speak, on the 44th anniversary of the Iranian Revolution, and he declared victory over the protest movement. Is he correct? What is the mood of the regime at the present moment?
Thank you, Ambassador, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and looking forward to the discussion. You ask a really important question. We have witnessed the most profound protests I think we have seen in the Islamic Republic over the past number of decades. And indeed, on the 44th anniversary of the Islamic Republic, it was very important for the leadership to declare victory, even though that declaration is very much hollow. This is a state that through these protests has really showed the gap between its population, various constituencies, and its leadership. It has shown its unwillingness to reform or address grievances which are profound and deep. And I think that these protests that we witnessed over the past 5.5 months have really, to me, showcased the depth of popular anger, the despair, the willingness of Iranians from all walks of life to push back in a very fierce way, something we have not seen before in the Islamic Republic. But the state is strong still in Iran, and I think that that was the message on Saturday. Through the rallies, through the willingness to push back very violently and repressively, the Iranian state continues to show cohesiveness, elite unity, willingness to be as coercive as necessary to stay in power. And I think that it is a mistake for us to assume that any of these features are going to shift immediately. This is a state that runs the country using institutions. It's quite institutionalized, and the elite in Iran remain very deeply unified, although maybe ideologically divided on certain issues, but remain unified on keeping this system together. So what does that mean for the protests and for the protesters and ordinary Iranians who have been deeply impacted through these protests, but also through the injustices of ordinary life, be it economic, political, social, and cultural in Iran? It means that I think we will see more protests in the Islamic Republic. The protests have always been prevalent in Iran, but they have become fiercer. And I think that the next round of protests will sort of signify the direction of popular mobilization. So I think protests are something that we should very much expect going forward. But in tandem with that, the state will continue to repress and push back. So I think the onus is very much on the Iranian population to build capacity, to build leadership, to build organization, and define the direction of this protest movement in Iran, because the Iranian state has laid its claim, and its claim is that it's willing to survive and will do whatever it takes to survive. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Sanam. Ali, you've studied this and previous protest movements in Iran very closely. What do you see that's new and defining about the current round of protests, and what continuities are there with previous rounds of protests since the early 80s?
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, for providing me with this opportunity to share my analysis with you. In Iran, people protest fundamentally for two reasons: for the sake of economic issues and because of political issues. More simplified, for the sake of bread or freedom. The protests that we have seen, large and important anti-regime protests in the history of the regime since June 1981. In other words, at the time that the regime had consolidated itself after the revolution, we have seen seven major protests, 4 of them economic, 3 of them political. The Mahsa Amini protests that we have seen in 2022-23, they of course belong to the political category, where people, particularly women in the beginning of the protest, but after that, men and women were out protesting for personal freedoms, which is a part of the political ones. Now, the protests that we have seen are significant because of 3 reasons. First of all, previous protests, we had tendencies to see localized protests, particularly in the 1990s. The protests would be limited to 1, 2, or 3 big urban population centers. Nowadays, we are seeing countrywide protests, and this is a trend that we see in the protests. This is in part due to changed technology. Iranians have access to mobile phone, and they also have access to cellular data, which means that they can be connected to the social media. Throughout the social media, they get information, and this radicalizes the Iranian Republic. A new factor which is also increasingly playing a very, very important role is the role of the Iran International Television, broadcasted in Persian language from London, according to many reports, funded and financed by the government of Saudi Arabia. This television channel is playing a very, very effective role in the protests, similar to that of the AGSIW television during the Arab Spring. So no longer local, they are countrywide. The second thing, which is really significant, is that the protests have become much more protracted. In the early 1990s, protests would last 2, 3, 4 days. Then it became week-long protests. Nowadays, we are seeing months-long protests. The months-long protest is particularly dangerous from the regime's perspective, because if people remain in the streets, or people just, the conflicts and the protests flare up different places all over the country, there may be a chance for the opposition to develop its own leadership, to organize secretly, to secure funding for their organization, and finally, through debate, also to have a unified vision for post-Islamic Republic Iran. This is very dangerous. And the third significant factor, and here I will end my answer to you, is that the protests have become much more violent. These protests, as you correctly pointed out, have until now cost the lives of 590 protesters and more than 73 government personnel. It is very important for me to emphasize that more than half of the 590 protesters killed were either members of Iran's Kurdish community or Iran's Baluchi community. These communities are not only ethnic minorities, but also sectarian minorities. They're both Sunni, majority of them at least. Now, this is extremely important because there is now an ethnic sectarian element into the protests, which hitherto were had a more, generally political outlook. It is also important for me to emphasize that these protests, the people killed, particularly the government personnel, more than half of the 73 individuals were killed by gunshots, gunfire. And these people, were mostly killed in Iran's periphery regions. Again, the people who were killed by gunfire were either killed in Iran's Kurdistan province or Iran's Sistan and Baluchistan province. So use of fire gun has become a part of the tendency that we see in Iran's protests. So as I said, just to repeat, no longer local protests, but countrywide, much more protracted and much more violent. These are the significant factors.
Thank you, Ali. Mohammed, you've written recently about Iran's protesters having crossed regime red lines in a number of actions that they took. Could you highlight a few of those actions that they took against those regime red lines and outline their importance, particularly from the lens of regime legitimacy?
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you for the panelists and for having me today. It's very important. These days, the political system in Iran is celebrating the anniversary of the victory of the revolution. Absolutely, these protests are very important, timely, and the nature of these protests. Talking about the red lines, what were crossed from my point of view during this protest, I can mention 4 main red lines which were crossed by the protesters. The first one, Khomeini, the founder of the Republic Islamic of Iran, was a respected figure. Khamenei became less, and we've seen these protests during the previous protest that death to dictator, death to Khamenei, but nobody talks about Khomeini, the founder. What we've seen in this protest, Khomeini's house in his hometown, Khomeini, a house which was turned into a museum, was burned out by protesters. So this is a very direct position from the protesters against the political system in Iran. The second red line was Qasem Soleimani, Of course, we know what Qasem Soleimani had been doing in the region, the proxies. This is the outside of Iran, but inside Iran, in a way or other, he was respected as a nationalist. He was a respected figure. They called him the Rustam of the era of the time. So he was popular among many different layers of Iranian society. But this has changed during the protests. So we've seen protesters burning out his pictures, his statues, and demolishing them in different cities, whether in south, east, or west, or central part of Iran. So this is important red line. The third red line, I would say, the turban, the umama, which is the symbolic. It's a symbol for the political system, the Islamic Republic of Iran. So as the Wilayat al-Faqih, which is the leaders and the superior leader. So umama, although people do not necessarily agree with the political system, but the umama, which is maybe Oriental, I think, culture more than political, was respected. All the elderly people, religious people, in a way or other, are respected. This has changed during this protest. So we've seen this trend on Twitter that people are recording, throwing the umama away from those religious people in the streets, and everybody tries to do that and share it on social media platforms. This is very important, something new mostly. The fourth one is the flag of the country, the new flag which was created or adjusted the previous one after the revolution 1979. Many people now think this doesn't represent Iranian people. So it represents more the political system of Iran. So during the World Cup in Qatar, we've seen people who were burning out the flag or those banners or posters in the streets because of the it had the flag and some people who are part of of course, the football team. So these are main, in my opinion, main red lines that were crossed during this protest. In addition to that, this wave is different from the previous one. Additional to what my colleagues were mentioned in their interventions, I would say this for first. Join the different layers of the Iranian society. So previously, during 2009, for example, or 1999, those protests were from the middle class. What is my vote or freedom of speech? While from 2019 to 2022 or 21, actually, it was people want to eat. It's more about economic situation and conditions in this country. This time, these two different layers joined together, and it is beyond ethnicities or religious, whether ethnic minorities or religious minority, whether Sunni, Shia. So it's not only Kurds and Blues, although they suffer more these days, but also we've seen it in Tehran, we've seen it in Mashhad, in some Azerbaijan's province cities. So it is beyond ethnicities, it is beyond religion, it is beyond sect. The other point I think it's very important to mention is that it has nothing to do with the hijab, although it started with that, with what happened to Mahsa Amini, but was the point when people looking for something, a reason to go into the street, and this was a serious reason to go into the street. So they are not protesting against the hijab rule in Iran or dress code in Iran. They are protesting more than that. This is about the political system. It is about the conditions in the country. So it's although many media platforms trying to minimize this wave of in Iran into just hijab or women issues. This is very important, has been there for a while, but it is not the only reason. It is more than that. Even in my opinion, during 2009, when people were saying, where is my vote? It was not Mahdi Karoubi or Hussein Mousawi in themselves, but it is more about the political system. And they were looking for a reason to protest against the political system. So sometimes sometimes class, sometimes from lower and grassroots people from grassroots, and especially the poor people who have nothing to eat or suffering because of the inflation, employment, and other reasons. So I will stop here.
Thank you, Mohammed. So we'll come back to a focus on the regime in a second, but let's take a little closer look at the protest movement in Iran. Ali, could you give us your sense about the scope of their accomplishments? Were any of their demands met, whether enforcement of dress code for women, reining in morality police, and what was the scope of the support that they built for these protests? Several of you have mentioned class affiliations, cross-regional affiliations, cross-ethnic sectarian. How would you assess the support they built and their achievements?
This is a very important question, and here I slightly disagree with Dr. Sulami, because I see the 2022-23 protests as largely middle-class, lower middle-class protests in the big cities. If the I would say the unprivileged classes had joined the protests would have been far more formidable and much more difficult for the regime to suppress. So I do not believe that we saw the solidarity between, let's say, the Iranian educated urban middle class and the unprivileged classes during these protests. That may be realized in the future, and as long as the protests continue the same trend that I tried to explain, if that is the trajectory that will be seen in the future, there may be solidarity between the two classes, and those protests will be far more difficult for the regime to suppress. As for the achievements of the protests, I think that one of the things which it demonstrated is that the middle class, particularly the very young people, no longer fear the repressive system of the regime. Perhaps because they had no previous experiences with how brutal the system can be. Now, the question, of course, is if they will be frightened. I believe that there will be a core among the protesters who have received their political education at the street level during the 2022-23 protests. Particularly during the first month of the protests, according to government sources, the average age of arrested people was 15 years old. They are very, very young teenagers. So if this is the beginning of your political education, you will end up being diehard revolutionaries by the time they're 20, you are 20 odd years old. So this is going to be a very problematic generation to control from the perspective of the Islamic Republic. That I think is very important. The second thing, which I think is quite remarkable, is that yes, the regime, first they tried to somewhat indulge and tolerate the protests, but as they began to flare up many different places in Iran, they received, the government received and the government forces received order to shoot. So in other words, they began actually shooting people to kill. And this is why we end up with a large number of protesters killed, the largest number in the history of protests in Iran, 590 individuals. And this is my extremely conservative estimate. There are some other higher estimates. Now, the really remarkable part is that Mr. Khamenei was out saying that all these people, all these young people, they're either foreign agents or misled by foreign security services. The Revolutionary Guard and its allies and political allies and media outlets, on the other hand, they said something else. They started attacking the morality police. They started a campaign in Javan newspaper, in Mashriq News, in many other media outlets of the Revolutionary Guard, attacking the morality police for provoking the protests by arresting this young girl and by being too harsh in the way that they enforced the hijab legislation. That was a very remarkable signal as I see it. And this also tells me that the Revolutionary Guard perhaps is trying to distance itself from the clergy. And this is here that I may disagree slightly with Dr. Vakil's assessment that there is elite cohesion in the entire system. I actually am seeing that the Revolutionary Guard gradually and very slowly is sending different signals to the middle class, telling them that, well, yes, we are definitely not going to be giving you democracy and political freedoms, but we do not mind if you do not wear the hijab. You can have your personal freedom. And that was the main message of the Revolutionary Guard through its media to the middle class.
Interesting. Thank you, Ali. We'll come back a little bit, I think, to the issue of conflicting messages in the regime and divisions maybe at elite levels. But let me ask you, Sanam, this question, and you sort of talked about it a little bit in your opening remarks, but I would be interested in following up with you. It has to do with the futility of protesting against a deeply authoritarian regime that routinely claims absolute religious sanction for any degree of violence that they use against dissent. And yet Iranians came out in tens of thousands in the streets. I would be interested in your assessment about how do you explain that? What provoked them in the streets in such large numbers? And to borrow the question from my good friend Hussein Ibish, has it been worth it?
Thank you. I think those are really key questions. Mind you, I'm a bit, I try to take this from a humble perspective. I'm sitting here very comfortably in London. So from a humble perspective, I wouldn't say the protests have been futile. I think that this is a protest movement that could be part of a broader process. And we shouldn't see the outcome of these protests in zero-sum gains or losses. At the heyday or the apogee of these protests last fall, there were a number of questions as to whether this was the big one, this was the moment, is this the revolution? And I see these protests as part of a process that we don't yet know what the outcome will be. If there will be regime change in the regime, transition, there are many outcomes, there are many scenarios that are far beyond my ability to predict and very much in the hands of ordinary Iranians and their willingness to take the steps to get there. I think that if we consider the sort of arc of history and when the pre-1979 revolution protest movement began, you have sort of different academic analyses, some saying it began in a nascent form after World War II, whereas others, of course, very clearly pinpoint Khomeini's entrance in the 1960s as really being pivotal. But that protest movement took a long time to develop. And what I think was essential for the development of that protest movement has been the development of networks and networks inside the country as well as outside the country that began to work together and mobilize and support each other to get there. So what this protest movement that we just last witnessed, I think, really showcased and developed, if I just want to be so bold to add on to Ali's comments, is that I think despite the political establishment's repeated sort of repression of networks and organizations inside Iran, what it showcased to me is that the traditional also cleavages inside Iran, traditional networks inside Iran, being in ethnic communities, students, women and labor groups continue despite not having formal organizations or a strong sense of civil society, because again, the state has been trying to decapitate those institutions and has been quite effective, is that those traditional sort of pillars of civil society still remain resilient and still remain areas where people are mobilizing within spontaneously and perhaps in a more organized manner. So I think that suggests that investing in those arenas remains really important, and important for this movement to continue to develop and build roots in spite of the regime's authoritarian resilience and in spite of the regime's repressive capacity. So we have to sort of watch that space and see how that space continues to sort of build upon each other. I mean, that's where I would see this. I also think that as an outcome of this protest movement, but again, also reflecting on the other important protests of 2009 and 2017 to 2019, we can really also show, I think, as a theme, that ideology and religious narratives are really rejected by the broader population. And so that is a big gap, legitimacy gap for the regime. They can't rely on traditional ideology from 44 years ago to mobilize or to communicate with the broader population. So how they develop new narratives, and we've seen them experiment with nationalism as a narrative and a mobilizing tool, will be key to watch as a space where they try to rehabilitate. Ali mentioned the reliance of constantly blaming external powers as the sort of go-to in their crackdown playbook or in their sort of protest playbook. And I mean, I think as a final point, I would say we do know that through these protests, the Islamic Republic has become much less Republican. And relies much more on their authoritative capacity to stay in power. So that I think is a sort of final theme that I would drag forward. The Republican element of the state has lost significant legitimacy. Reformism, as part of that conversation, loses legitimacy in the public narrative as well. So watching how the state tries to manage, for example, parliamentary elections next February of 2024 will be important to see if they try to claw back or rebuild in any way, as part of their effort at showing that they are in charge or are taking a victory lap. And I'm not saying that they are, but these are the sort of elements that we have to continue to watch for.
Thank you, Sanam, and thank you for the reminder about the need. I think all of us take it on board, the need to approach this with a certain degree of humility as we sit comfortably observing these events from afar. Mohammed, what is your sense of where things are with the protests now in Iran? Have they, as one analyst put it, have they fizzled out, except for some funeral marches now and then? What do you think is the mood in Iran with the protesters now?
It is very difficult. Iranian people know very well how to move. They have this experience, especially during the last 4 decades, or at least last 15, 20 years. So they know how to deal with this, and they have the IRGC or Basij into states have no mercy. So, and they have experience with that. So it is very difficult to predict. If the protesters are betting more on time, so they want, the longer they stay in the street, the regime will become more frustrated and cannot focus. The regime also thinks with the way, the more this protest stay in the street, they will get bored and want to go back into their homes. So, but I think, in my opinion, first, it's established a new phase in the protest against the political system in Iran. We cannot go back. This is for sure. Mm-hmm. New phase in the protest against the political system in Iran. We have coming in few weeks, maybe 5 or 6 weeks, 5 weeks maybe or less. We have the Nowruz holiday, mm-hmm. and people will go and celebrate outside their houses and try to move from city to another. And this is, I think, another time when we see more protesters also into the streets. I'm not sure about that, but I think as big cities, you will see more people into the street, whether because it is a national holiday or people also will try to again support those people who have been protesting during the last 3 or 4 months. This is the one issue. The second issue is the cohesion among the political elite in Iran. I don't see them as cohesive, and they have the same attitude toward how to deal with this protest. This is one. Second, what is the way forward? For example, the more they give positive reactions, for example, about the military police, people asking more. This is one. Second, we've seen statements from previous, what they call reformists in Iran, whether Mohammed Khatami or Mir Hussein Mousawi. People think the regime is asking those people to give their own opinion because the regime has been playing with these two, the political, the Khamenei office, let's say, playing with these two files, the reformists and conservatives. So if you have bad experience with Ahmadinejad, we have Hassan Rouhani. If you had good experience, for example, with Hassan Rouhani, and because of the international environment, because of the sanctions against Iran, we have Ibrahim Raisi, who was more stronger and has a revolutionary position. So this is very, very difficult for the regime to continue. The other thing is among Khamenei officers, although this is very small, but we have seen his sister and his daughter of his sister were again supporting in a way or other the protests. This is something new, in my opinion. We cannot compare Khamenei family to for example, Hashemi Rafsanjani's family, which is different, more outspoken, like Faiza or Mahdi, or those people who've been talking about the shortages that's coming from the regime and the way how to deal with issues inside Iran. But Khamenei family is something different. The more, I think, the more the protests continue, the regime become more nervous, cannot control maybe their actions. That means the reactions that's coming from the protests will be higher. So I'm worried about the way this protest is developing in terms of the security issues inside Iran. We don't, maybe it started very quick and may just, vanish or stops very quickly. We don't know. But as I said that from the beginning, both sides playing more depending more on time. The more time they stay, maybe they more gain differences. So they are not asking small reforms. In my opinion, it is more than that. It is. I'm not talking about the regime collapse or regime change, but they want to see serious, very serious inside. You cannot continuously blaming the outsiders, the regional player, national community, but you have a serious issue inside. You have to solve it yourself.
Thank you, Mohammed. Let's transition a little bit and look a little bit more intensively at the regime. We've talked about it, and folks have approached it from different angles. Sanam, I'm going to come to you in a second and ask you to elaborate on your idea about regime resilience. But Ali, first, let me ask you this. In your view, why do you think, if you do think the regime has prevailed so far, why do you think it has prevailed? What combination of tactics and approaches have they successfully deployed?
First of all, if we compare the Islamic Republic with the Pahlavi regime, I think the big difference is that the Pahlavi regime was a personalist dictatorship. When the person of the Shah was incapable of making decisions because of cancer and because psychologically he was not fit for leadership. He simply was not. Then the entire system collapsed. The Islamic Republic is far more institutionalized. Even when Ayatollah Khamenei is not capable of making decisions. And more often than not, especially when it comes to domestic crisis, we see that Ayatollah Khamenei disappears from the public eye, for weeks. The institutions see to it that the system survives and makes decisions, and those decisions are made in the Supreme National Security Council. So in other words, when it comes to the institutionalization of the regime, this regime is far more, I would say, resilient than the Pahlavi regime. It behaves much more rationally under extreme pressure. The second factor, as I see it, is that the regime does not shy away from using brutality. The Shah's regime was very careful. I'm not saying that the Islamic Republic is not careful. They too, and forgive me if it sounds somewhat perverted, but they too, the Islamic Republic too, is economical when it comes to killing people. This is not the Assad regime massacring 250,000 people in order to secure its survival. They do kill 590 individuals in the course of countrywide protests in order to prevail. This number is not large enough to provoke an international outcry and let's say a civil war ending in the U.S. Air Force sending in the planes to bomb regime positions as happened in Libya. But at the same time, it's enough numbers to scare a good number of middle-class Iranians who do not want to see themselves or their kids getting killed in the streets. So brutality is also a reason why the regime survives. And lastly, I also do believe that the regime is also extremely pragmatic, as I try to explain with the Revolutionary Guards appeals to the middle class, which I do believe is very, very clever. They are preparing themselves for the day that Ayatollah Khamenei is no longer among us. And that day, they do need middle-class support. And middle class, if they can bribe it with personal freedoms, and now that they are incapable or unwilling to give the middle class political freedoms, that may actually be a solution for the regime. So in other words, three factors: institutionalization, brutality, and pragmatism. These are the factors. And there's also a fourth factor, which we have not discussed yet. Perhaps we will discuss it another day. That is the weaknesses of the opposition. An opposition which has no leadership, no organization, no sources of funding, and no unified vision for post-Islamic Republic Iran. The three main factors and the fourth one, they, in my opinion, secure the survival of the regime.
Thank you, Ali. Sanam, I'm going to ask you you've already talked some about regime resilience, and I wonder if there was anything else you wanted to elaborate on that resilience, and also talk about the challenges that the regime faces despite that resilience.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to develop this. First of all, this framework of authoritarian resilience is not mine. Let me give credit to where it's due. It's many scholars have written about authoritarian resilience. It isn't unique to Iran, but I'm drawing really from the work of Steve Levitsky, who has published a new book on authoritarian resilience. And I would just say that despite the sort of conditions I've laid out, to go initially to the issue of having a cohesive ruling elite, just because they're cohesive doesn't mean that there are no divisions within the elite. And in fact, within the book, they do actually look at the case study of Iran, which has a unique factionalism that's inbuilt inside the system of the Islamic Republic. And the unity is evident in the fact that, more or less through each round of protests, the ruling elite is cohesive in sticking together. Doesn't mean they don't have different strategies on how to address the challenges that they're facing. And we, in fact, very much do see divisions, not just coming from regime opposition like Mir Hossein Mousavi, but also from former President Khatami, as was mentioned. And also there have been discussions from members of the ruling elite themselves, the Speaker of the Parliament, the head of the Supreme National Security Council. You know that there are debates taking place on how to address some of the challenges. But to look more deeply at the challenges, I think might have us question resilience over a longer period of time. And I would just say that we're in a period of the Islamic Republic's transition. I would say that we're moving away perhaps from thinking about, at least I am, the Republican part of the Iranian state as being important. And I think that, maybe we should reframe our thinking so that whatever comes next will be the third version of the Islamic Republic, the first being the Khomeini years, the second being the Khamenei years, and the third being the question mark that we don't know is ahead of us. So as the political establishment faces the uncertainty of the future, there are scenarios they have to consider. They could be a decaying second republic. They could be an Islamic Republic that is facing paralysis because it can't make decisions. Or it could be an Islamic Republic that addresses the challenges that include obvious, longstanding, bleak economic data and corruption and mismanagement. There's, the ideological dimensions that I pointed to, the declining legitimacy with their people that we've seen through the protests. There is endemic factional infighting that is now really clear between pragmatic conservatives, if we want to give them that name, and neoconservatives that are also at odds over how to address some of these challenges. And last and certainly not least, and Ali has his vision of this issue, succession, being actually the big elephant in the room that I think is also impeding how the Islamic Republic prevents and perhaps staves off decay or paralysis and addresses how to transition into the Third Republic. And that is, I think, the biggest challenge on its horizon as well.
Thank you, Sanam. Mohammed, I have a slightly different question for you. I noted at the beginning of my remarks that the regime started executing protesters in December. Do you think that that as an aspect of the violence they're willing to use has made a difference? In other words, has the regime prevailed primarily by means of violent repression?
Yeah, it is very clear. It was a clear message from the political system to protesters in Iran that if you continue, if we catch you that in the street, that, for example, whether you try to kill somebody or burning or something, execution is waiting for you. This is trying a message, mostly domestic message to who are into the street, making them, at least for family issues. That is, people who want to be very careful, asking their kids to be very careful not to go to the street because the regime is waiting for you and will kill you. I don't think this will make it very difficult for people to continue because it is, in my opinion, a position from a weakness point of view that a regime cannot resolve the problems, cannot meet the demands of people who are asking. It's very clear the demands into this, asking the regime to do. They have no solutions. They don't know what to do with this protest. So they are using this execution tool. During the last 3 decades, we have seen many executions. Iran #2 in terms of executions globally after China. So this is very known. And people inside Iran try to put more pressure on the regime. I think we'll try to, they have been asking help from outside, but it is not a military action. It is more like people asking for free internet, more for asking the diplomatic missions of Iran outside Iran, I mean the embassies to be shut down, or ask diplomats to leave the country, to put more pressure diplomatically, to ask Iran or to suspend Iran's memberships in the international organizations. This is, I think, a very important step has not been taken, but people are asking international community to play its role, not by military means. They are very nationalist. They don't want a war against their home country. Nobody wants a war in the region, but they want to put more pressure, not give Iran the space, for example, to go to Geneva and talks about human rights, for example, in the opening ceremony, Human Rights Council. So this is the thing people are asking for. But in my opinion, the more people go into street, Iran will, their political system will try to find ways to deal with this, not only executions, because executions will not resolve the problem. People will not stop going to streets. And I think it is, in my opinion, again, it is not middle class, because people who were killed in Zahedan, for example, in Baluchistan, who were just going out from the Jum'ah mosque, is just ordinary people. People just going out and was killing there, and no differentiation. It's everybody, kids, families. Kids are not middle class. We have been, I think, more than 50 or 60 kids were killed. So it is not middle class alone. In my opinion, it's both or different layers of Iranian societies, ethnicities, labors everywhere, and I think there is no organized, what you call it. People do not organize their events together. So there is no kind of arrangements, for example, Zahedan and in Kermanshah or other places. If there is this kind of arrangement between protesters, at least to make it easier for other people to, there is lots of pressure, like in Kurdistan, people in Baluchistan try to do something to shift the focus, the regime, that people there can have a bit of release at least. Not seen it, but I think with the more time, people will learn a lot. In my opinion, because there is no leaders for this protest, is a positive side, not negative for Iranians, because the experience they had in 2009 is very important. There were two leaders, Mahdi Karoubi and Mir Hussein Mousawi. When they were captured, everything stopped almost. So now the regime doesn't know with whom the regime is dealing. So this is I think this is a plus for the protest, not a negative side. But of course, I agree with Ali about the future Iran. People are worried about what will happen, what will come after if this regime collapses. How would the political system in Iran look like? Even regional countries are worried about this. They don't want to see another Taliban. They don't want to see a civilian war among Iranians. They don't want to, maybe many countries don't want to see a divided Iran, like minorities. They have their own demands. So they want to see, they don't want to see more chaos in the region. Let's put it in this way. So enough is enough. So I think the more the international community prepares itself, I think, to deal with I am not talking about 1 year or 2 years, but in the future, it is the regime is now, I'm not saying last days, but at least the last years of its age. So I think maybe in a decade or less, we will not see a wilayat al-faqih.
Thank you, Mohammed. A quick question. I have two quick questions, and we'll close out this sort of examination of the regime and move on to some of the notes that Mohammed began to introduce about the international community and the international dimension. But first, Ali, who's up and who's down in the regime? Does a rising tide of repression float all regime boats, or have there been some losers in this months of unrest?
But, first of all, I completely agree with Dr. Sulami that, the Zahedan protests were not middle class. It was regular people. And I have been studying it very closely. My conclusion is that the entire affair was an avoidable and terrible, tragic mistake. This did not need to happen. it happened because of terrible mistakes made by the local head of police. The people who were done after the Friday prayers, they were angry about the story of one girl who reportedly had been violated, raped by Revolutionary Guard commander in Chabahar, far away from Zahedan, by the way. So people marched towards the local station. The police chief in Zahedan obviously should have been more clever, rather than, responding. He should just, ignore and try to stay out. But what did they do? The Revolutionary Guard members and the policemen, they panicked. They began shooting at the protesters. At some point, some of those protesters began shooting back, which is why a quarter of protesters killed in the entire course of the protests were killed on that one incident in Sistan and Baluchistan, in Zahedan city. And a quarter of the government personnel killed in the course of the protest were also killed on that one day. It was an avoidable and a terribly, terribly tragic mistake. As for who's down and who is up, clearly, as I see it, and as Dr. Sulami and others have pointed out, the religious authority of the Shia clerics have been going down for a very long time. In the history of Iran, ever since 1501, when Iran became, Shia religion was elevated into the religion of state, the Shia clerics were very clever. There was a clear division of labor between the rulers of Iran, being the kings, and the clergy. The clergy would give and lend legitimacy to the king as the shadow of God on earth, and the king would protect the faith, see to it that people paid their religious taxes, and conquer more land, so there would be more Shia paying taxes to the Shia clerical establishment. It was a good arrangement for the Shia clergy. What happened in 1979 revolution and the current constitution that we have is that the clerics became both the head of state and head of church. Now, that means that if government has shortcomings, and all governments have shortcomings, of course they do, then the church will also be blamed. In other words, if there is unemployment, people blame the clerics. If they go to the hospital that they cannot receive what the constitution says they should be receiving, free medical treatment, they are now blaming the Shia clergy. So what I see, not only in the course of these protests, but as a result of unity between church and state, is that people are blaming the clerics for all the ills of society. And this is also why that the Revolutionary Guard has a slightly better chance, in my opinion, to say that we are not the church, we are not restricting your freedoms when it comes to what to wear and what not to wear. What if you would like to have, alcoholic beverages and those kind of things. So the Revolutionary Guard has a chance that the clerics no longer have, because of 44 years of a regime in which clerics have
Ali, can you hear me?
Yes, I do. Yes. And I just wanted to conclude that unity of church and state has been a disaster for Shia religion. And serious clerics are very, very concerned about the future of Shia Islam in Iran because of the 44 years of Islamic Republic.
Sanam, can I just follow up and give you a chance for a short answer before we tie this part off and move on to the sort of regional dimension of the issue? Have protests reinforced a trend of decreasing religiosity in Iran, and how is that going to impact regime legitimacy?
Thank you. I think that it's very hard to say if there is a deliberate shift that will come, but what we do know is that there has been very clear shift away from the religious components of the Iranian regime now for well over, I think, 2 decades. Polling demonstrates that there is a declining association with the Shia clerical establishment, declining respect that we've seen through this protest for clerics who have had their turbans disrespectfully knocked over as part of the sort of protests, for example. people have a greater association with atheism or more other aesthetic traditions. So I think those trends are certainly going to continue. We don't know how they're going to evolve going further, but for the political establishment with declining religiosity and declining legitimacy, this puts them in a bind in how they manage governance and their interaction with society going forward. So it remains to be seen if there is other narratives, be it a nationalist narrative or other narratives that can be reinvigorated, or if they are content to rule in the authoritarian repressive way that they have made clear through these rounds of protests as a prevailing strategy of the state.
Thank you, Sanam. Mohammed, I want to broaden the aperture a little bit and talk about the regional dimension of these protests. We'll explore that issue with you briefly, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So let me ask you, Mohammed, how has the crisis in Iran played out in Arab Gulf countries? How have leaderships, in your view, of course, how have leaderships viewed the protests, and how have they been covered in the Arab Gulf media?
Very important. First, let me just very briefly mention how Iran developed this outsider issue. That is, from the beginning, they blamed, like, for example, what they call it foreign agents, and then they blamed for what they call foreign governments, and in particular they mentioned Saudi Arabia, Israel and United States. Then we had third I think attempt from the regime, at least, to blame somebody. The other is after what happened in Shiraz. And they blamed ISIS for that. And they announced that we captured people come from Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, and Afghanistan, and they were behind this. We're trying to unite the domestic fronts that somebody is playing with our security issue. The fourth one was a direct threat against Saudi Arabia and Kurdistan of Iraq. And we have seen everybody listen to what the commander of IRGC, Hussein Sulami, said in their direct and clear threats against Saudi Arabia and Kurdistan of Iraq. So this is the way, is trying to export the domestic problems, try to blame the other for their own shortages inside. From the regional perspective, no big, I think, statements from at least Gulf GCC countries. There is no mention from officials, in my opinion, whether Minister of Foreign Affairs or politicians, officials at least, about what's happening inside Iran, because they think it is a total domestic issues. We will not interfere in the other countries' internal affairs, because we are blaming Iran their behavior in the region, that they are interfering in our internal affairs. So we're not doing the same thing. Media, it's there at the beginning was the headlines about what happened inside Iran, but generally speaking, it's in the international media outlets. It's not headline anymore, because our media outlets looking for catchy titles. They want something new. They want to attract the readers that we have new news. But this is not new news anymore for doesn't bring money or readers for media outlets. Therefore, there is no big focus. People think, of course, of what's happening in Kurdistan, in Tehran, and big cities, but there is no serious follow-up from following in the Arab media. Maybe articles, opinion articles here and there. So it is not one of the 5 top titles, in my opinion, unless it is focused programs, like, for example, Arabiya al-Hadath. Sometimes they have this focus show on Iran or regional issues, but it's not really the main titles for news agencies or TV channels.
Thank you, Mohammed. We're going to open it up to questions now. I believe we have a question from the chairman of our board. I'm going to ask Raymond if he could open it up so Ambassador Wisner could ask his question.
I found this morning a fascinating set of presentations, and I thank the three speakers. It's been broad, it's been deep, it really is insightful. I want to come back to one point and direct a question more at Alfoneh, and that is your assumption or your prediction that the more likely scenario for the succession to the supreme leader will be a succession guided by, dominated by, shaped by the IRGC. Can I get you to talk a bit more about that in terms of the current protests? How have those protests changed the trajectory in your mind? And how would it evolve as you make obviously some assumptions about the future? How do you see the rise of the IRGC playing out?
Thank you so much, Ambassador Wisner, and my apologies for the earlier fallout. As I see it, the IRGC is now the only organization capable of imposing its candidate on the Assembly of Experts, which is choosing the next leader. And not the least because the IRGC is also the sole institution capable of defending the regime against domestic protesters and external protesters. The clerics have, for all practical purposes, become hostages in the hands of their own Praetorian Guard. Now, the question is if the Revolutionary Guard is clever enough to have a cleric succeed Mr. Khamenei or have some kind of civilian leadership leading the country and also having responsibility for all the future shortcomings of the regime, or it will take control over the country directly. If they're clever, they will follow the Pakistani model, where the Pakistani military has some poor chap sitting in the presidential palace, and every once in a while there is a short military coup, and the people will actually cheer the military, which is throwing out a corrupt politician, or a politician who is perceived as incapable and corrupt by the public. So the Pakistan model is the one that I'm anticipating. The big question is if the IRGC is also capable of delivering what the middle class is demanding, or at least some of it. The middle class is demanding democracy. That is something that the IRGC cannot deliver. But the IRGC is capable of delivering personal freedoms. Are they clever enough to make that, alliance with the middle class, or at least some parts of it? That I think is a question. And the other thing is, will the opposition have an effective leadership which is capable of negotiating with the IRGC and extracting concessions from it, or will they just engage in sloganeering against the regime and the IRGC? These days, we are actually seeing some opposition formations outside of Iran, which is not bad, by the way. And I think it is going to make the opposition politicians and political activists much more mature in their understanding of politics and how these things work. So yes, IRGC is going to inherit the regime after Mr. Khamenei, but it needs alliance partners, particularly among the middle class.
Thank you, Ali. A couple of questions from the audience. Let me frame this one and put it out there for whoever would like to take an attempt at it. Many Iranian political activists claim the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia do not want these protests to succeed because a weak ideological regime with an aggressive posture is used as a bogeyman by each of these countries to advance their own national interests. Do you have any evidence that policymakers in the three countries mentioned feel this way or that they're acting this way? Sanam, you want to tackle that first, and then maybe Dr. Mohammed, if he has a perspective on it?
Thank you. I don't have any evidence. And in fact, I would sort of challenge the assumption. It's easy to be conspiratorial. But frankly, I think I would lay out there that the Islamic Republic poses an international security challenge. And it has the challenge stems from its unmonitored and advancing nuclear program that is not currently being discussed in the public domain too much, but without dialogue as well as deterrence, this program will advance and definitely pose a challenge to regional states, to the non-proliferation regime that has been set up, to international security. And I think I would just use that as an example to say that it isn't in anyone's interest to look at this perpetual crisis with Iran through that prism. I would also, just put out there that how the international community manages this uncertainty over Iran's nuclear program is a huge challenge and a delicate one that needs to return to the public domain and public discourse, and requires a mature engagement, because we also don't want to get to a point where the political establishment in Iran chooses at some point to move away from a posture of nuclear ambiguity towards making their position and their choices very clear, and declaring its intentions towards a nuclear weapon state. So that is, I think, something that we need to re-engage with and understand the consequences of the protests and Iran's own choices in this dynamic. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanam. That was an incredibly interesting answer, and I want to try to circle back to it if we have time in this question period. Dr. Mohammed, I wanted to give you a chance to also address that question I raised about essentially raising the issue of, has there been outside support, and what is the posture of the United States, of Gulf states, of Israel towards the protests? And I would just broaden it a little bit. What do you think, for example, the West in particular, what should its attitude towards these protests be? Or should they just stay out of it?
Yeah, thank you. I think I think we can agree all that there is no outsider factor in this protest. It's mostly domestic issue. So it is people who are motivated by the issue domestically, not another country or another or agents outside, or an Iranian, opposition groups outside Iran. So it is mostly from within the country. This is one. The second thing is for regional countries, we really we're not thinking about if this regime will change or not, if we have new regime, or if it's better for us to continue such regime. For us, it's very clear. We have problems with this political system. We have the proxies, we have the militias, we have the missiles, drones, the attacks against the regional countries. We have what the Iran call it, the controlling of 4 Arab capital cities, or the Lebanon, Beirut, Damascus, Baghdad, and Sanaa. So what we are looking for in the future is to have a normal state, have a better relation with Iran, and to have a better contact, let's say, with the political system in Iran. So have a normal relation, let's say, with their I'm not talking about the strategic relations, but at least there is no wars, there is no proxies. The second thing, we are worried about refugees. We are worried about chaos. We are worried about wars in the region. We have been suffering for decades from wars in this region. So I think enough is enough for us in the region. We don't want more wars. We wish all the best for Iranians, but we cannot really guide them what can they do or what kind of political system they want to have in future. This is up to them. Right? About the international community, I think they have been just in the watching mode. They don't do much, only statements, or what they call it, individual sanctions on individuals, which is very symbolic, have nothing. There is no impact, zero impact on in the political system in Iran. If you put sanctions on a commander or somebody in the IRGC, what affected does it have? Nothing, really, zero. So I think it's more about the international agency, about the diplomatic and political relations with Iran, about the political isolation, the diplomatic isolation with the political system in Iran, to put more pressure to help Iranians inside Iran, and especially in the other countries. Like, it's not only when something changes inside Iran, we'll see the impact in Baghdad, in Damascus, in Sana'a, and other places. So I think it's up to the international community what they want to achieve. I'm not talking about sanctions. More sanctions is enough. I think there is no monitoring. It's became like quantity more than quality. It has no effect. Iran now is selling more than 1.4 million barrels per day to China and other countries. So there is lots of sanctions, but there is no enforcement. There is no implementation of sanctions. So it became toothless. There is no use. There is no return from these sanctions. No pressure on the regime. So I think if we have just tried to put, very smart, I would say, sanctions on the political system in Iran, and implement enforcement of the sanctions, and more political and diplomatic isolations of the political system, whether in terms of countries and in terms of international organizations, I think that will a bit help, in my opinion. This is my opinion.
Thank you, Mohammed. Ali, I wonder if you wanted to comment about the earlier observations that Sanam was making in bringing in the sort of overall dynamic or backdrop between the protests that are going on and the other issues that the West is dealing with Iran, which is the nuclear program. Any observations on that in any respect?
Well, I think, when it comes to the regional issues, Dr. Sulami did not make any references to the Iran International Television, which is funded by Saudi Arabia. And it has become the main platform of the Iranian opposition. Obviously, the protests in Iran began because of domestic issues. But exactly because here the Iranian opposition, anyone opposing the regime, has a platform to engage in effective propaganda and psychological warfare against the regime, the protests continue. So that is why Saudi Arabia is an obvious target of this Islamic Republic. I was expecting attack directly against Saudi Arabia, but then I saw the head of MI5 telling the world that the Islamic Republic of Iran had engaged in certain activities in London and that the British security services had foiled several operations. And I cannot think of other targets of interest to the Islamic Republic intelligence services in London than the headquarters of Iran International Television and some of the employees of the Iran International Television. So the big question, I think, is how will Saudi Arabia react if it is targeted directly on its soil by the Islamic Republic? Will Saudi Arabia try to dial down the criticism of the regime in its services in London, or will it continue? Will it use the Iran International Television as a bargaining chip with the regime in order to achieve some degree of understanding in Yemen and other places? So I see it as a competition, rivalry between two very, very important powers in the Persian Gulf region, Iran and Saudi Arabia. And by the way, I think it's a perfectly good thing that Saudi Arabia has developed Iran International Television and is supporting it, because there must be some kind of balance in the Middle East region. If there is imbalance, if the Islamic Republic is the only party engaging in provocations against Saudi Arabia using proxies and, let's say, Al-Manar television of Hezbollah broadcasting programs against the House of Saud, and Saudi Arabia is not responding to this, there will be imbalance. There must be balance, so there also be some kind of a balance of terror. After all, I do know that there is a difference between balance of terror in nuclear terms and balance of terror when it comes to media warfare, psychological warfare. But the Islamic Republic has clearly a vulnerability, and Iran international television is displaying all these terrible vulnerabilities.
Just to follow up on that, Ali, quickly, are you surprised? I mean, the regime now seems to have, at least in this phase of crisis, has weathered it. There hasn't been attack or escalation against Saudi Arabia for the reasons you outlined. Are you surprised that that there hasn't been more Iranian lashing out about at Gulf actors about what's going on inside Iran?
I must say that the IRGC did not hit Saudi Arabia after General Sulami's speech, in which he said that provocations broadcasted to Iran from London may be responded to in the hot deserts of Saudi Arabia. They said hot deserts of Arabia. They don't mention Saudi. But I actually expected a direct attack. But then to my surprise, statements that the response was actually planned to be given in London rather than the hot deserts of Arabia.
Yes, Mohammed.
Yes, it's a very important point. First, talking about the international, Iran International, it is a private international channel that registered in London. And I don't have any proof that is sponsored by the government, and I haven't seen it, at least. This is one. Second, Iran has more than 50 channels in Arabic, one of which is Al Alam, which is part of the Sazmana Sadosima, which is very clear, totally directed against Saudi Arabia. Press TV, for example, it is directed against Saudi Arabia in particular. Mayadeen, Al Manar, and all these are sponsored by Iran. And part of that, we have more than, I think, 40 TV channels, which is more ideological, more about Shia and Sunni, so it's more sectarian. So Saudi has this only if Saudi has this, if it's only one TV. This is one. Second, there is a news in Iran, and it's called Iran International. So it covers what's happening inside Iran. Third, about what you mentioned, that you were surprised Iran didn't attack. Actually, there was an attempt, and I think there was exchange of information, intelligence information between Saudi Arabia, that Iran is preparing itself to attack Saudi Arabia. I think this is the only reason that Iran didn't try to do anything else, only in Kurdistan, and have been doing that. Fourth, Iran have been attacking Saudi Arabia before Iran International. What happened in 1996 when they attacked the two towers in Al-Khobar, where 19 Americans were killed? At that time, there was no Iran International. So they are not looking for excuse to attack Saudi Arabia. They have been blaming Saudi Arabia for everything happening inside the country. So I don't see it in that way. Because of Iran International, they will attack Saudi Arabia, or there is surprise that they didn't attack. So we have many Saudi diplomats were killed. I think 8 Saudi diplomats were killed in Asia and Europe by Iran, Karachi. In Iran itself, that time there was no Iran International. So I think the regime has a problem with its neighbors. It's not only Saudi Arabia. Now they have attack against the Azerbaijan embassy in Tehran 2 weeks ago was a typical behavior of the regime. So the embassy attacked twice, the American, of course, from the beginning, the British, the French, and many other embassies. So I think this is the problem. It's trying to export the domestic problems and try to find somebody to be blamed. This is the only problem. But I don't see a link because there is Iran International, there is an attack against Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Mohammed. So we're coming to the end of the discussion. I wonder if each panelist would like to take a minute or two and wrap up with any final observations. Sanam, would you like to start?
Thank you so much. First of all, I think this was very rich and interesting, and I enjoyed the comments from Ali and Dr. Mohammed. So thank you for having me. Secondly, I think as we sort of wait to see how the dust settles in these protests, or if these protests revive and regenerate, I think it's important to sort of zoom out and consider the implications, not just domestically in Iran, but more broadly on the region. So I just wanted to close by sort of reflecting that regional instability and remains a primary challenge for all of Iran's neighbors and for Iran's dynamics with each of the GCC states. There still remains no vehicle or no arena for regional states to manage or engage in a cooperative manner to address the myriad of regional challenges. And there instead appears throughout the region to be a prevalence of having bilateral relations with the Islamic Republic from the smaller GCC states, for example, as a means of managing or trying to push back against the prospect of future instability and sort of unpredictability of the Islamic Republic. I think that in absence of sort of externally led direct sort of dialogue with a JCPOA that looks really unrevivable, the onus, it really appears, is on regional states to begin to sort of step up and step in to the multiple arenas that include hard security challenges like climate, the pandemic preparedness, but also in developing opportunities for multilateral dialogue to begin to not necessarily resolve all of these issues, but to begin discussion. The Middle East remains the primary area of the world without a regional security construct, without a framework for states to cooperate or coordinate. And I think that that is urgently needed. And the case of Iran, or the waiting for the next protest or the next revolution in the Islamic Republic, is a sort of naive way of managing regional security. And again, as the world is preoccupied, rightly so, with the war in Ukraine, it is time for Middle Eastern states to step into this space and to begin thinking about security issues, really, because the next protest can be around the corner for any regional state. The Arab Spring is a decade ago, and it's not just Iran that is vulnerable to protests. The main features that we've seen inside Iran also exist beyond Iran. So the security space urgently needs attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanam. Dr. Mohammed?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation, and it's very rich. I would like to zoom out a bit and think about strategically, at least. Iran is our neighbor. We cannot change geography. We cannot choose our neighbor. And we have to coexist with our Iran. We have more shared values, and of course, in terms of culture, in terms of religion, in terms of they share the geography. So I think we have more in common. And Iran has more soft power that can use better than proxies to have influence across the region. We have this experience during Mohammed Khatami period. I am part of that. At that time, I studied in Iran. I did my MA at Tehran University. So I think building on that and looking at least when I'm from Riyadh and talking about Saudi at least issue, that we have the Vision 2030, which tries to include all neighborhood, all the neighboring countries, including Iran itself. So we have like mega projects, and for us, Central Asia is very important. To go to Central Asia, we need to have better relation with Iran. Right now, for example, if you want to travel, I have been traveling to Central Asian countries. I have to spend like 5 hours. If there is a direct flight from Riyadh to by Saudi Airlines or Saudi company airplanes, 2.5 hours. So I have to go all the way from Iraq, Lebanon, and all the way, Turkey, to go to Central Asian countries. Transit is very important for both countries, and it has its own revenues for both countries, whether to Africa through Saudi Arabia or to Central Asia through Iran. So I think if we manage to to resolve these problems. And it's very easy if there is a will in Iran. If there is will, in terms of just putting aside the dependency on proxies and militias, and try to come to table negotiation and try to think about, to do it together, at least. To have, during the Shah era, for example, we have lots of difficulties, political difficulties, but we managed to resolve those issues around the table of negotiations. We just meet and try to resolve it. No militias, no proxies, no sectarian issues. So this is actually my message. If we just talk about describing the issue, there is no step forward. If there is, I have been doing this track to meetings with all Iranians for like 6-7 years. There is no improvement. Still square number one. In my opinion, we need to at least to talk to those people inside Iran, more the revolutionaries, more than the government, more than people from Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the presidency office, people who are really doing the show, the people who are on the ground, which are the AGSIW people, Khamenei office. I think if there is will inside Iran, I think people are prepared in the region. I think Saudi is more prepared than anybody, but they need to build the trust. There is mistrust. We need to build the trust, and at least that we see change the ground from the Iranian side, and that time you will see more steps from the Saudi government and the leadership towards Iran.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. Ali?
I completely agree with Dr. Mohammed. Iran and Saudi Arabia are two countries with large, extremely well-educated middle classes. And it's going to be fascinating to see how each regime type, both in the Islamic Republic and in Saudi Arabia, manages to engage those middle classes in political decision-making in the coming years. We will see which regime manages this best. And when it comes to the rivalry between the two neighbors and two regional powers, I fundamentally and sincerely believe that Middle Easterners are better than the Europeans. The French and the Germans, the French and the British, and all other Europeans engaged in world wars, massacred each other until they reach the conclusion that all that is futile and they get together in the European Union. Arabs and Iranians do not need to repeat the experiences of the Europeans before they reach that conclusion. And I do fundamentally believe that Iranians and Arabs are capable of doing so and capable of managing in a rational way the rivalry that there always will be between two major powers in a relatively small region. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. I want to thank all of our panel members for a terrific discussion. This has been really, really interesting. So thank you all for the preparation you did and for the time you spent with us today. It's been a great discussion. Thank our audience very much. We enjoyed having you. Look forward to seeing you at our next AGSIW event. Thank you very much.